I'm Lauren Sega, Manager of Communications for Homeport, a nonprofit affordable housing developer in Central Ohio. We're in one of the fastest growing areas in the country, and while we've seen the growth, we've felt the pains that come along with it, especially when it comes to housing all of us and our incoming neighbors. Each month, we're interviewing local experts on the issues, the barriers, and the solutions around housing and development, hoping to shed some light on how we got where we are and what we can do to create a future that houses everyone. This is Level With Us. Today we are joined by Matt Martin, Director of Community Research for the Columbus Foundation. Matt's educational background is in urban affairs, city and regional planning, and African and African American studies. He's worked in planning both at the local and regional level, and he went on to work as researcher at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, where he worked on opportunity mapping, helping communities understand their landscape and their geography of opportunity. Matt joined the Columbus Foundation about 7 years ago, and as Director of Community Research, he helps inform their grant making and communicates with donors, community partners, and anyone who's working to strengthen and improve the community. Together, we briefly discuss how the racial gaps in housing came to be, before diving into a conversation on where funding for affordable housing is needed, where it's coming from, and how we can inspire more interest and investment in it. Let's lay the foundation. To start, Matt gives us some insight on how his background informs his current work at the Columbus Foundation.
I trace it back to really going up to Cleveland with my dad several times a summer as a kid to go to baseball games. We'd go to Cleveland then Indians games, and we would park outside the city and take the RTA into Tower City, walk over to Jacobs Field, and I know at the time that was, the immediate purpose was spending time with my dad and seeing baseball games, but looking back, that was my earliest exposure to a big city and what that was like, and I know that was shaping my curiosity, not just about infrastructure like trains and streets and that sort of thing, but about how cities function and how they function or don't function for people in the city. And then when I was in college, I did a spring break trip one year, kind of a urban ministry trip to Chicago, and that I think really solidified my interest, not just in cities, but again in how they serve people, how they underserved people, and how we can improve the way that cities work for everybody. I spent a lot of time with an addiction recovery ministry on the south side of Chicago, and just seeing what it took to help people get back on their feet, help them get back into stable employment, and all the barriers other than housing that people have to get over, and the challenges that they face. So I went into that trip, actually, I was still a marketing major at the time. This was probably the spring of my sophomore year, and I had been relatively undecided at that point. I knew by then, marketing is not what I thought it was, and it's definitely not for me, but I didn't know what was. And on the way back from that trip, I had a friend tell me, there's a city planning program at Wright State, which is where I did my undergrad. And I went and looked it up, sure enough, and changed my major the next week and never looked back. So
That's wild.
Yeah.
And the work at the Kirwan Institute was probably just a very natural transition for you.
It was a combination of both my academic studies, which that's an interesting journey too, because I actually started with, I thought I was going to do a minor in religion. And I started down a path that was a dual degree program. There were dual degree courses, religion and African American studies. They were about kind of how early Puritan theology shaped a lot of the racism and the racist policies of America. I thought I would
very interesting
Yes.
subject. Yeah.
And I was very intrigued by that thread, but I was learning so much more about American history and about how racism, played such a significant role in the shaping of the country that I just ended up following that path more in my studies and ended up finishing a minor in African and African American studies. And so between planning and that and starting my career in the local and regional planning context, those were all the ingredients for what became my work at the Kirwan Institute, doing regional opportunity mapping and trying to help those communities. And we worked with communities all over the country, trying to help them understand that and how to create policies and investment strategies that would build opportunity where it was relatively low and also provide access to places where it already existed, often in the form of affordable housing in those communities.
Community leaders and officials have more recently invested in righting these historic wrongs with different levels of success, thanks to more people talking about it, more people sharing their stories, and more research coming out.
Those things, those are much more often cited now than they were before 10 years ago, before 10, 15 years ago. I think what is still a little bit less understood, the work of like Richard Rothstein and The Color of Law and those types of books and research has really helped with this, but it isn't just a smattering of random policies and laws that had this, end effect.
Yeah, incidental.
They were related and they stacked on each other and they sort of snowballed over time. And so, it's not a coincidence that the same places that we disinvested in strategically for a number of years, by the middle of the 20th century became the places where we felt more okay about building highways through. Right. Because the value had diminished, at least in so many perceived ways, right? And so, and then those places that had limited access to credit, those were the places that were most ripe for predatory credit later in the 20th century, and that, of course, gave way to a lot of our foreclosure crisis. So they just sort of snowballed and kind of led from one to another, and they had a very cumulative effect that was, more than just 1 + 1 = 2. It was a multiplier effect over time. And
right.
A lot of those things are still in play.
And now it's time to level up.
I think so many of the needs that we see in the community and in the broader economy do come back to housing. The need for stable and affordable housing. If you think about how your address determines access to educational opportunities, how it determines not just your access, your proximity to jobs, but also your ability to consistently get to a job on time. If you think about how the cost of your housing affects the rest of your household finances and your ability to buy food, medicine, stay healthy, those kinds of things, a lot of things come back to housing. And so we see it in applications from nonprofits who don't necessarily work in housing, but the lack of affordable, stable housing is affecting their clients and their members in various ways. Mm-hmm. And of course we see it through the work of organizations like Homeport and the need not only to build and maintain housing, but to provide wraparound support for residents as they build their lives.
This is a concept we've touched on throughout the show here on Level With Us, how housing interacts with every issue. Housing is foundational. It's a place to start from that allows you to build more in your life. But the market is not set up to provide affordable housing without incentives, and public dollars are limited. Tackling other barriers, supporting folks after incarceration, through health struggles, to find employment, and more. Easing those stressors that often become financial burdens can get people in the position to be able to afford housing.
I think one of the good things about the new zoning proposal is that it at least requires the developers to do the units.
Yeah.
It does away with the fee in lieu of, which was fine, but really the units are what we need as a community, and so to see that be promoted. And then, it is a challenge because there are some areas where the requirement for the bonus isn't even 60 and 80. There are places where it's only 80 to 100. And so that even addresses deep affordability challenges even less. The tools at our disposal as a community to get to 60 and 30% of AMI are so few and far between, and so in some ways so fleeting, because some of those tax credits that help us do that only last for 15, 20, maybe 30 years. And so it is, in a sense, like a never-ending battle, because you have to stay on it as units age to make sure that you find new ways to preserve affordable housing even after it's kind of gone through the life of the tax credit.
Matt says donors are looking to develop and preserve affordable housing and to keep people in housing, and it takes a few different forms. Through the foundation, that's meant funds like the Housing Action Fund, which has brought affordable units online, as well as support for operating costs at the Shelter Board, and funding for the Maud Hill Growing Home Ownership Fund, administered by Homeport, which you can learn more about in Episode 2 and Bonusode 2.
In philanthropy, at least, donors are often looking for promising programs and initiatives that they can help prove the impact of by helping them get started, with the understanding that a lot of things that are going to be sustained or scaled are likely going to have to happen through public sector investment.
That investment, though, is limited, and even if all the public dollars available for affordable housing development were released into the world today, it still wouldn't be enough to meet our need. Throughout a lot of our conversations so far, we've tiptoed around the question of how we hold private companies accountable for their role in providing the housing needed to sustain the workforce that, inevitably, they benefit from.
I think we do see more employers paying attention to the need for housing.
Yeah.
I mean, also the need for transportation, but, one big example was, when Amazon was searching for a headquarters location, and we were, I think, in maybe the 20 finalist communities that they were looking closely at. This is a number of years ago. One of the things I heard is that they were really scared of crushing our housing market. So at least you have big corporations who are starting to acknowledge their impact in those sort of ways. There are, some corporations who realize that there's a role to play in housing, and that's, we funded some research over the last couple of years to try and help our broader community and our donors understand the potential effect that Intel will have on Central Ohio. Obviously, people are worried about the housing market. When you look at some other technology companies, big technology companies, we're talking like Apple, Microsoft, these sorts of companies in markets like Seattle and in other places on the West Coast where they've been, they have taken different approaches, but they do invest in housing. Either from the perspective of like planned master communities, or from the perspective of working with local elected officials to make sure that zoning ordinances and those types of things make it possible for investments in affordable housing to to expand the housing inventory and to address needs for affordable housing. So there are some examples like that. It remains to be seen what all of our corporate partners will do on that front. But I mean, the Housing Action Fund is a good example of, especially the banks, some of the bigger and some of the not so big banks in our region investing in that. And Lark Mallory's doing a great job with the Affordable Housing Trust to make sure that we don't stop there, but that we build, a housing action fund that can address those needs regionally. So, I think the private sector understands that need and that connection more than ever before. And the other thing I think that both private and philanthropic funders will need in order to go further with this is results. When we continue to hear that we are falling short of the number of units on an annual basis that we need to be producing as a community to keep up with our growth, that's not comforting. And I don't want to see us as a community get to a point where we use the word crisis so much that we feel like, well, what's the use? We're never going to catch up now, and there's no way to prevent this from going, the way of, like, let's say an Austin or a Seattle or a Bay Area.
Yeah.
We're not there. We definitely have challenges, but we have a lot of the resources and the wherewithal, I think, to address it if we stay on top of it. I think when donors and funders see progress, I think we'll be motivated to keep going as a community. And so I think these next couple of years are going to be really important for that.
So crisis talk can make donors hesitant to invest, but what can push them to invest? Matt says, as with anything, philanthropy follows trends and must respond to external factors. Donors pay attention to where other funds are flowing and where they're not, and their interests are as diverse as all the things that need funding.
Philanthropy is no stranger to trends, I think, and I think there's certainly always the idea that one need is going to take precedent over the other, and we need to focus here. I mean, one thing you're definitely seeing is that a lot of the corporate and philanthropic commitments that were made to things like racial equity, in 2020, a lot of that is already starting to fade. So to be investing in racial equity today is, unfortunately, kind of a demonstration of philanthropic leadership in some ways. But it's also like, we've left that on the sidelines for a long time as well. And so I think, to realize that there are some things that should have been invested in for a long time and are going to need to be invested in for some time to come is really important, right? You can't overcome 400 years of history in 4 years.
Right.
So there's a lot of that due diligence that we need to just maintain as a community. But yeah, I think public influx of dollars over the last few years has been pretty significant, pretty sizable federal and state investment that helped hold up a lot of our economy and the nonprofit sector during the pandemic. And a lot of those dollars are set to expire, and organizations understandably are turning to other sources of funding. They're turning to their donors and saying, like, how can you help us fill this gap? And donors, either individually or foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, will be unlikely to be able to fill the hole that will be left from the discontinuation of some of these ARPA dollars. But that isn't to say that the levels of support that predate the pandemic can't be continued. I mean, philanthropy is always going to play a role, I think it's just important to recognize like the relationships that you've been cultivating all along with your donors, with your funders. Those are going to be important to, to keep going and to not ask them to do or to be more than what they can be. I think that, the sectors all play really unique and important roles. But I mean, you can't expect the public sector to continue spending money at the rate that it has the last few years to, help us survive the pandemic. So you can't necessarily expect the other sectors to pick that up either. So I think that's part of the challenge right now, and we need to figure out how to create efficiencies and how to collaborate and how to learn from things that happened during the pandemic, maybe different ways of operating, different ways of serving our communities, serving clients. I think there are organizations that are definitely doing that.
It's so hard to get your hands on unrestricted dollars, though.
It is, and that is honestly one of the challenges that we face in the community research and grants management department at the Columbus Foundation. Is, of course, we're helping to inform individual donors, but then we're also working with field of interest funds and a variety of different more or less restricted pots of grant money, and always trying to maximize it and connect it to the organizations and initiatives and programs that need them the most. And so sometimes it's a little bit like a Rubik's Cube or like a corn maze or something, but I think that's part of the the challenge, but the beauty of philanthropy is there are donors who are interested in every part of our community, arts to zoos, everything in between. And if we only focused the dollars on housing, we could probably have a bigger impact. But if we only invested in housing, we would miss other needs that are simultaneous, and we would miss also maybe opportunities to make life beautiful and enjoyable as well. So it's a challenge, but it also is a good thing that we have dollars that can only be used to support this variety of things, so that we can keep growing and improving and becoming stronger and more inclusive as a community in this comprehensive way.
Yeah, that makes sense. How common, if at all, is it for a funder to be like, here's some money, put it where it's needed the most?
Well, one thing that I think certainly the Columbus Foundation learned, I think other funders learned this during the pandemic. I don't know what its shelf life will be, but I mean, we established an emergency response fund in the first month or two of the pandemic, and I mean, we were basically making all of our grants through that fund, and it was totally unrestricted. Use it for what you need to use to get through this time. And we don't have an emergency response fund like that still in operation, but what we took from that is to the extent that we can, from like a budgeting and administrative standpoint, we should be making multi-year grants whenever we can, and we should be supporting operating whenever we can, or at least, the least restrictive grants that we can make. And so we have been working with some of our donors and our supporting foundations to say, hey, I know in the past, operating costs or overhead has not been something that, you've wanted to support, but one thing we heard from these organizations, your grantees, is, during the pandemic, is your support really meant a lot to them when it came with less restrictions and it helped them do more. So maybe we can carry some of that through the pandemic and continue to support organizations in that way. One of I guess you could call it a fad. I hope that it sticks. It's not a new thing per se, but trust-based philanthropy is the whole idea that, if you've established a relationship with a grantee, with an organization, you've seen their work product, you've seen the impact that they have in the lives of the people they serve and the communities that they serve, trust them more.
Mm-hmm.
Make grants that they can use in more pliable ways to meet the needs of the people they work with. So we've definitely taken that to heart and are doing more of that than we ever did before the pandemic. And I think other funders have learned that as well. Some of the good news in Central Ohio is that more institutions, more parts of our community are engaged in the affordable housing conversation than ever before. We have great examples with the Housing Action Fund, with the MORPC Regional Housing Strategy that was pre-pandemic, but still worthwhile endeavor to develop a regional thinking around it. The work of the Regional Housing Collaborative, and so I think that's a good thing. I think, if anything, there still may be individuals on the sidelines who they understand the need for more housing, but who either lack the margin in their life to be more engaged or feel like their voice would be drowned out by maybe those who would be opposed to more housing or change. And I think we just need to create more ways for those voices and more ways for individual donors and other funders to know how they can get involved in various ways and in various levels. I mean, if a donor wants to contribute $10,000 to something, that's great. If a donor wants to contribute $100,000 to something, that's great too. But how can we best leverage those types of investments in that philanthropic capacity to move us further up the field as a community? And likewise, if individual people who see the need and see the effect in their community of us falling behind in housing, if they can realize ways, avenues that they can use their voice and be involved, then that's great too, obviously. And we've been sponsoring the Big Table every year for a number of years now to give voice to and give a platform to just those types of people who are curious and want to engage their neighbors in their community around these issues, and they just need opportunities.
Level With Us is brought to you by Homeport and is recorded, mixed, and edited by Lauren Sega. All sources are in the show notes. Homeport creates strong communities by developing quality, affordable homes on a cornerstone of dignity, security, and opportunity. To learn more, or if you'd like to support our mission, visit us at homeportohio.org.